We tend to think of giant multinational corporations as a pretty modern thing. But what if I told you that the most powerful corporation in history existed centuries ago? From just a single office in London, the East India Company grew to rule an entire subcontinent, commanding an empire that, honestly, no company today could even dream of.
So that's the big question, right? It's the one we're going to dig into. How on earth did a private business, a company made of merchants and investors, manage to conquer one of the richest and biggest regions on the planet?
To really get your head around just how wild this was, let's just do a quick comparison. A modern corporation, right? It has security teams, it sells products, and it pays taxes. Okay. The East India Company, it had its own private army, it ruled over nations, and it didn't pay taxes. It collected them from millions of people. This was a corporation acting like a country. So, how did they get there? Well, the story doesn't start with armies and conquest. It starts with something much simpler: business. The company's beginnings were actually pretty humble. It was just a trading venture, looking to make a profit from the spices and textiles of the East. And the secret sauce that made it all possible was this really clever business model, the joint stock company. See, before this, only governments could really afford these super expensive, super risky overseas trips. But now, regular citizens back in London could pool their cash, invest in an expedition, and get a cut of the profits if it paid off. It basically privatized global exploration. What's really striking is just how long this transformation took. This was not an overnight thing. I mean, they got their royal charter in 1600, but it took almost 40 years just to get a real foothold. But from there, things really started to speed up, leading from a huge military win in 1757 all the way to conquering Delhi in 1803. It was this slow burn that just exploded into a wildfire. The Battle of Plassey in 1757, that was the moment everything changed. This was the real turning point. A small company force, led by a guy named Robert Clive, used its superior weapons to defeat a massive local army. And this victory wasn't just about trade deals anymore. It gave the company direct administrative control over Bengal, one of India's richest regions. The shift from merchant to ruler had officially begun. After that battle, the company's power just went through the roof. It became less of a business that did some trading and more like an empire that also happened to run a business on the side. Okay, let this sink in. By the year 1800, the company's private army had over 200,000 soldiers. Most of them were local troops called sepoys. This wasn't some little security force. It was a massive military machine, bigger than the national armies of a lot of countries in Europe. This was the muscle that powered its expansion. And that muscle was protecting some seriously profitable businesses. The company had a total monopoly on all British trade with India. We're talking every last bit of tea, silk, and spices. On top of that, it was now the one collecting taxes from the millions of people living in its territories. And then there was the opium, grown in India and forced on China in a trade so massive it literally started wars. But this is where the fatal flaw starts to show. The company was brilliant at making money and it was brilliant at winning wars, but it was absolutely terrible at actually governing people. Its main goal, always, was the bottom line for its shareholders back in London, not the well-being of the people it ruled. And the consequences of that? They were catastrophic. The Bengal famine of 1770 is just the most horrifying example. An estimated 10 million people died. The company's response was just completely inept, way more focused on keeping tax revenues up than on, saving human lives. It was a brutal, devastating sign that a for-profit company is not equipped to run a country. And that brings us to the final act. Because the very things that made the company so powerful, its military aggression, its constant focus on extracting wealth, well, those things ended up planting the seeds of its own destruction. In 1857, all that simmering anger finally boiled over. A massive rebellion exploded across northern India. And look, this wasn't some small mutiny. This was a huge, violent uprising against nearly 100 years of company rule. It involved soldiers, nobles, regular people, everyone. So what pushed them to that point? Well, it was decades of what they saw as crushing taxes. It was seeing their local kingdoms just swallowed up by the company. It was princes and nobles being stripped of all their power. And the final straw? The company's own native troops, the sepoys, turned on their bosses and joined the revolt. The rebellion lasted for over a year, and it was brutally suppressed.
But the sheer scale of the violence sent a shockwave all the way back to London. The verdict from the British government itself was that the company was, and I'm quoting here, no longer capable nor trustworthy to govern the country effectively. The corporate experiment had completely and utterly failed. So what happens when a company gets too powerful to even exist? The British state decided it had no choice. It had to step in and take the whole thing apart.
And the end came fast. First, the rebellion proved the company couldn't handle the job. A year later, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, which basically nationalized the entire operation. All its land, its entire army, its government workers, everything was handed over to the British Crown. And just a few years after that, the East India Company was officially dissolved. Gone.
So corporate rule was over, but colonial rule definitely was not. Instead, one was just swapped for the other, and this new version was made official. The age of the East India Company was finished, and the era of the British Raj, direct rule by the British Empire, had begun. And that system would stay in place for another 90 years.
And that kind of brings us to a final thought. The East India Company wasn't just too big to fail, it became too powerful, too much like a government, to be allowed to exist as a private business. It leaves us with a question that feels just as important today. What does a story like this teach us about the line between corporate power and state power in our own time?